My talk is probably suggested, or part of my talk is suggested by each one of these words separately. So the long history of humanity is a clear demonstration that we are at our best when we are open. Open to new ideas, open to visitors, to new people, open to new things, open to new ways of working. However, very few of us, peers, this is for you, very few of us are bold enough to be as open as Piers. This is his office space, which seems to have no boundary walls or fences at all. Most of us live behind walls. These walls are dual-purposed. They say, keep out. They say, go away. Leave me alone. And they define me, mine, my space. We're so familiar with boundary walls that they're usually invisible, unless they're like these and won a special award for being groovy. Walls actually have to be spectacular to be noticed. But actually, they're only a very recent feature of human societies. Look, no walls. The agricultural revolution, sorry, I'm on the wrong slide here. There. The agricultural revolution, which turned nomadic, foraging hunter-gatherers into settled pastoralists about 10,000 years ago across the Middle East, necessitated self-defensive and self-defining walls. These walls around Jericho are particularly famous. Archaeologists have dated them to about 10,000 years before Jesus was born, about 20 miles west across the hills. Other great walls include this spectacular Chinese 10,000 li wall. Li is a measurement of about a third of a mile. Construction started about the year 220 BC on the orders of the Emperor Qin, who has given his name to China, of course, and it had the dual purpose, as with the other walls that we looked at earlier, of keeping the barbarians out and defining the emperor's domain within. It's the longest continuous human construction on the planet. The Roman limes Germanicus was built as the Roman Empire's northern boundary. It's the second longest continuous human construction on Earth. It also had the dual purpose of keeping barbarians out and stating very clearly civilization ends here. If we look at this area in particular, where, as you can see, the River Rhine on the left-hand side of the screen and the River Danube in the bottom right-hand corner form the natural boundaries but don't meet. The limes was built to keep the barbarians out, to close the gap, to enclose a particularly fertile area of what is today southern Germany. Just here, at Salburg, archaeologists have reconstructed the gatehouse. You can see the ramparts and the walls to either side of the picture, and the gatehouse itself is no small affair. This wall, which you can see here, is much more recent. Does anybody know where it might be? The worst that can happen is that you can be wrong, and we've already been told that failure is good. Okay, I see a hand. Not Constantinople. Good idea, good thinking. What's the wall? Portugal. Portugal. No. European in construction, but not in Europe, is the right answer. So this is the Dutch wall built in 1628 to define their new Castello, they call it, New Amsterdam, developed by Peter Stuyvesant. Those of you of a certain age might remember Stuyvesant cigarettes. And to keep it separate from the Red people who lived here. And the Red people, as the Dutch called them, their name for this space stands still. This is Manhattan. This wall we know as the Berlin Wall. It's the concrete section of what Churchill called the Iron Curtain. Properly speaking, we should use its 1961 East German name, the Anti-Fascist Protective Barrier. It's the odd one out of the walls that I've shown you. Anybody know why? Well done. Thank you. This wall was built to keep people in, not to keep others out. In our own time, walls are still being built. The Israelis call this the West Bank security fence. Understandably, the Palestinians on the other side. So this is the Israeli side with the roadway, and this is the Palestinian side without. The Palestinians call it the apartheid wall. The Israelis built it between 2000 and 2003, understandably, to reduce the jihadist suicide bomber problem. And it has worked. The wannabe Banksy clearly shows that some of its neighbors have very different dreams. But this wall has a long reach. What you read here is part of an exam answer given by a student in this school a couple of weeks ago in a religious studies exam about religious conflict. And you can see here that we have the protagonists, the Jews, and Palestine, the Muslims, conflict, and so on. Even here in provincial England, that wall and that division reaches us and influences our students. What can I say? The proposed scale of this wall is, again, spectacular. If it's actually built, it would supersede the Roman limes, and it would become the second longest continuous human construction on Earth. Walls like these are all born of fear of the future, and desperation. Desperation to cling on to the status quo or some falsely remembered golden past. None of them achieved their aims for very long. Here is the Great Wall of China, and most of it looks like this, and most of it has usually looked like this throughout its history. There were only two periods when the Great Wall was extensively developed coherently and rebuilt to last. One was under the Ming Dynasty, starting in 1474, and more recently in the 1950s, the stretch around Beijing, near Badaling, usually built using, as the original wall was built, using convict labor. The Roman limes, as you can see, are overgrown and long disappeared. They were originally built to keep out the Huns and the Goths, and they failed spectacularly. Rome itself was sacked within a couple of hundred years of the limes being completed, and just a few years after that, the new Roman emperor in the West was himself German. So, Wall Street is now much more famous for other things. That wall I showed you earlier had a life of less than 70 years. Its new British owners removed it in 1699 to make space for a new business district, and it's still there. I took this photograph on a school trip to Berlin a couple of weeks ago that some of you in the audience joined me on, and what a super time we had, and thank you. I took the photograph because I particularly like the legend, this one, which loosely translates as, there are many walls to be torn down, to be unbuilt, is the sort of German phrase. Let's consider one of the best built walls ever. At the end of the First World War, most of northern France looked like this. Even the cathedrals and the churches weren't sacrosanct. And understandably, this injured war veteran and later politician, whose name has become a byword for futility, who believed genuinely that he could work out an answer that would stop this horror happening to France again. André Maginot understood very well defensive techniques of the time. He understood very well France's capabilities. And what he envisaged was a system of defense that would protect France from the Germans next door. The system that was designed looks like here the stuff of dreams, the dreams almost of model makers, but these were not dreams. These designs were for actual fortifications which were actually built. To the disbelief of the Nazis, here is a particularly unpleasant Nazi, Kurt de Leuger, who was one of the masterminds of the Holocaust, visiting to check out exactly the reality of these fortifications. And their visits showed the Germans that all their spy work across the border in the 1930s was well worthwhile. They had no idea, though, that these fortifications were as good as they were. However, although walls like these can work, they're only ever very limited in the ways that they can work, and they only ever work for very limited amounts of time. They cannot help us against a future that we don't understand. We cannot possibly know what the future will bring. The best defense is an open mindset, as I'd like to discuss with you now. Even the youngest of you in the audience have lived through extraordinary and unpredictable changes, especially technological ones. These changes would probably have bewildered your great-grandparents, even though they too lived through extraordinary changes. My grandmother was your age, she was a teenager, when Louis Blériot flew across the Channel in the first powered flight, and my grandmother learned about this from an old-fashioned thing called a newspaper. She herself flew in a jumbo jet like this from one continent to another, and she even watched man walk on the moon live on television. There's a little warning about the next slide. It shows something particularly revolting. You'll get a sense of what's coming from my next phrase. An immunologist would probably disagree with me that future-proofing is an impossible and wrong-headed dream. The eradication of smallpox must rank as one of mankind's greatest ever achievements. But, and it's a big but, let's think back to the future-proofing that Louis Maginot envisaged with his line of defenses. France's interwar future-proofing was an impossible dream. That was the answer. And it took the Nazis about 3 weeks in the summer of 1940. Hitler's only problem here was how much to tip his tour guide. And that is true. So, the best approach to the future is not to have fixed ideas of defense or boundary. The best approach is to be open-minded, is to be skilled up, is to be generous, and to be flexible.